today, where we are going to have amazing conversations with our expert and also with number of organizations who have joined in. So thank you so much for joining in on time. Just a few logistics that we have to take care of. What you see on the screen is please put yourself on mute to minimize any background noise during the session. There is a chat box available, so if you would like to share some comments, thoughts, please do share that in the chat box and we will pick it up from there. In case you require any assistance, if you're not able to hear us properly, we have the live captions option that you can see on the screen that will enable to understand what we are having the conversation on. And in case of any technical difficulties, I have my colleague Sandeep Nair who's logged in as well. So you can ping him or you can send an email to him as well. I just want to also confirm that this session is getting recorded and this would be utilized for the future conversations as well. A quick poll. We would request you to kind of share your answers on the chat box. Have you read the Trans Bill 2019? Yes or no? I request you to be honest. Definitely your answers are not going to be shared with anybody, so it is going to be anonymous. You have 30 seconds more to answer this question before we move to the next one. All right. The next question, to what extent do you understand the Trans Bill 2019 on a scale of 1 to 5? Number 1 being no idea at all, and number 5 being I understand the pros and cons of the bill. Thank you so much for the responses. Moving to the third question. Um, what about the Trans Bill 2019 do you expect to learn from today's session? So you have 6 options there. The first option is gain insight about the Trans Bill 2019. The second option is process of self-identification of gender identity. Third is rights given to the trans community by the bill. Why the LGBT plus community is rejecting the bill. How does the bill impact organizations and their trans inclusion journey? And all of the above is the last option. All right. Great. Just to kind of summarize on the polling options that we had, about 70% of the participants have confirmed that they did not read the trans bill or the trans act as yet. The second question, there's a mixed response between the first, third, and the fifth option. And in the last question, we had most of you answering all of the above. most of you have clicked the last option, which is the F option. So thank you so much for the responses so far. The agenda for the day looks very, very simple. We would be setting up the context by Vijaya Mart, who's our country head with community business. And then following that, we would have the Trans Bill 2019, what it means to the trans community and organization which is committed to the LGBT plus inclusion. This is going to be a conversation with Deepta Rao, who's a legal expert, joined us today as a speaker, and then we will open this conversation for question and answers, followed by wrap up and close. So with this, I would like to invite Vijaya K. Mart, country head, to set up the context, please.
Thank you, GB. About LGBT inclusion in the workplace. So we always look at three fundamental levels of LGBT engagement for companies. So basically, when you look at the first one, the first level is at a policy level, and then you look at the second one at a culture level, and the third one, which is more at an activism level. So the first level definitely is more for the internal audience, the LGBT employees within your own organization. At the next level, we look at both internal and external audience. And at the next level, which is the activism level, so it has a reach beyond organization and as a reach at a very wide public domain as well. So many organizations are working towards LGBT plus inclusion at various levels. There are organizations whose policies include gender identity and expression as a protected category and prohibit discrimination and harassment. There are very clear-cut processes and guidelines on gender transition and how organization can support the transgender employees. There's a huge focus on education and compliance to create awareness about LGBT plus community. Organizations are also providing gender neutral restrooms, allowing employees to really complete in terms of the freedom of gender identity. There is also organization focusing on modifying their dress code policy to avoid any kind of gender stereotypes. And more, we also see a focus on using gender neutral language in all the communication in the organizations, or highlighting the use of right pronouns to be able to acknowledge and allow freedom of gender expression. So in a way, the organizations are focusing on providing equal opportunity and also ensure that there is inclusion in the workplace, even in terms of the benefits. There are many organizations who are already working towards providing equal benefits of all employees, irrespective of gender. So when you look at all these steps, many of these steps have influenced not just the organization culture and the employees within, even many of the initiatives by the organizations, which is also focused towards the wider community, has impacted the lives of transgender people beyond workplace. In this context, a focused effort for inclusion of transgender employees in the workplace, an act by the government, surely has its own influence and impact. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019 is an act of the Parliament of India with the objective to provide for protection of rights of transgender persons about on the 12th November and as you know that, okay, on the 5th of December, it was signed off by the president and now making it a law. So there has been a lot of discussion, debate, different points of view expressed on this act. Our effort today is to understand it better, more so from an organization perspective and from the lens of the trans community, how this act impacts inclusion of transgender people in the workplace. Before we really begin this discussion with our expert for the day, I would like to just take a few minutes talking about our organization, More so for many of you, maybe who are attending the community business event for the first time, and set this context. So when we talk about the organization, so community business is an organization with a mission to lead, inspire, and support companies to have a positive impact on people and communities. It is our effort to bring in the expertise that we have to create awareness about the various policies and processes and enable organizations on how they can be truly inclusive of their employees. Our purpose is to harness the power of business to drive social change. What we do to be able to achieve all this? So we basically look at leading various campaigns, and of course, as you know, LGBT plus inclusion is one of our key campaigns. We bring companies together under Dine India Network, which is our diversity and inclusion network to bring organizations together to learn and share best practices. LGBT plus inclusion has been one of our key focus areas in enabling organizations through this network. Our key differentiator in as an organization is the research that we have been doing. We have been known for thought leadership, especially in the LGBT inclusion as well, bringing out various research publications on LGBT inclusion in the workplace. We host events, conferences, award ceremony to showcase best practices, and here again, LGBT plus inclusion is on top of our agenda, and we recognize the best practices of the organization through this recognition. We drive programs and provide training and consulting on all aspects of diversity and inclusion. Of course, LGBT plus inclusion being one of the key focus areas. Various programs on LGBT inclusion, ally workshop, inclusive leadership, unconscious bias. So these are some of our key offerings. This showcase is basically to talk about our pioneering research in the area of LGBT inclusion over a decade. All this research work you will be able to access through our website. The recent one being the definitive guide on LGBT plus workplace inclusion in India. We launched this resource guide in September this year to commemorate the first anniversary of Supreme Court ruling on Section 377. And this guide has specific focus on inclusion of transgender employees. It's not just enough to provide resources, but it's also important to help organizations know where they are in LGBT inclusion journey. Hence, we are bringing LGBT index to India. So we are starting with LGBT plus inclusion pre-index assessment starting January 2020 as a preparation for India's first LGBT plus inclusion index, a public ranking of organization later in 2021. I talked about the awards earlier. Here is a showcase of finalists and winners of our LGBT plus inclusion awards for the last 2 years. So I also talked about our awards and conference, and as I shared earlier, our focus definitely is in terms of recognizing and sharing best practices. So we will open the nomination for the awards for 2020 in May, and the awards ceremony is planned for September 2020. As organizations focused on LGBT inclusion in various aspects, all that I talked about so far, it was our first response when we heard about various aspects of trans bill. First step is to understand what it is, what are the implications to transgender community and organizations working towards inclusion in the workplace. So that's the very reason why we planned this session, invited all of the D&I professionals, the HR leaders, business leaders, with our expert today to have this conversation. So let me now invite GB Joyce to really take this conversation forward with our expert Deepta Ram. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijaya, for setting up the context. And hello, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for joining this important discussion on transgender persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. Well, it is an act of the Parliament of India with the objective to provide for the protection of rights of transgender persons, their welfare, and other related matters. We are also aware that while this act is established to extend support to the transgender community in India, however, there has been a huge unrest when the act was even at the bill stage and passed by both the houses in the parliament. Well, today's conversation is intended to understand the nuances of the act. What is its actual definition? How will this have an impact on the transgender communities in India? And largely, how will this act affect our workplace ecosystem? So I'm very excited to have this conversation with our very own Deepta Rao. Well, Deepta is a known name to all of us, and she has been a long friend of community business. However, let me just introduce her formally. Deepta Rao is an advocate and co-founder of Rahi, which is based in Bangalore. She works extensively on crisis intervention for the LGBT plus community across Karnataka. And her areas of work include gender and sexuality, domestic violence, media law, and mental health. So thank you so much, Deepta, for joining us today. Uh, we would love to see your face, Deepta.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes,
Thank
we
you.
can.
Thank you so much.
Lovely. Deepta, so this is going to be a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure a lot of organizations who have joined in today are keen to know from you. First of all, my first question would be, what is Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019 all about? Would you be able to share some insights on this act, please?
So, in a nutshell, the conversation on transgender persons' rights began in 2014 with the Supreme Court's decision in Nalsa versus Union of India. And the Supreme Court back then had created a set of very specific guidelines which dealt with the right to self-identify a person's gender identity. They lay down certain rules and regulations for the inclusivity of the trans community into society at large. And also, they placed a burden on the government of India to create a sort of framework to ensure that trans communities have access to public spaces, to healthcare, to education, to employment, and to other basic fundamental rights that we as cis heterosexual citizens otherwise take for granted and enjoy. And the Supreme Court back then had set a deadline of 6 months from the date of the Nalsa judgment to actually put in place schemes and programs and a framework legally to ensure that trans communities then become integrated into mainstream society, as we call it. Immediately after the judgment, Tiruchi Shiva, who was a member of the Rajya Sabha, introduced a private member's bill to basically build on the Nalsa judgment. That bill was very well received because it was the product of several community consultations, and the community's very specific lived realities were captured in the structure and framework of the bill, the kind of safeguards that it had, and the kind of language that it used. Subsequently, however, in 2015, the bill was reintroduced in the Lok Sabha by the current government that we have at the center, which eroded and kind of chipped away at very fundamental legal safeguards that the trans community had enjoyed, that had been recognized in the Nalsa judgment by the Supreme Court. Subsequently, there was a mass movement across the country to essentially make sure that a bill that is contradicting fundamental rights of a trans community person does not get passed in Parliament. So, what we then saw was 4 years of campaigning, lobbying, activism, protests to amend the problematic parts of the 2015 bill. And this conversation has been recurring in 2017, 2018, and earlier this year as well, when the Lok Sabha made minute changes to the current act and then reintroduced it, passed it in August this year. From where it went back to Rajya Sabha, it was passed in the Rajya Sabha on the 26th of November. And as Vijaya mentioned earlier, it has received the President's assent on the 5th of December. Um, Right now, the place where we stand is that the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act has been passed. It is now part of our statute book. However, it's only been published for general information. It hasn't yet been notified in the Gazette of India. And it will come into force only once the government chooses to notify it on a particular date. Some points of confusion that many people have had so far is whether this law is automatically applicable. It is not yet enforced. We still need to wait for it to be notified. Only then will both private companies, establishments, NGOs, and also the state government be bound to follow its provisions. However, it's just a matter of time. We still just need to wait for the act to be notified.
Great. And so you did mention about, that this act is going to be enforced, sometime in the future. And definitely, we do understand that there perhaps are certain loopholes in the act because of which why the transgender community at large is very upset about. So Deepta, as part of the diversity and inclusion efforts, many companies in India today is working on their hiring strategies to hire talents from the transgender community. Do you think this act will be a hurdle for companies to hire candidates?
Absolutely not. Actually, if you look at the act, one of the few good things about it is the mandate that this act places on both the public institutions like government authorities, government bodies, state-run institutions and organizations, as well as the private sector, to ensure that trans persons are given an equal opportunity to be hired, an equal opportunity to grow within an organization, an equal opportunity to be promoted, and reap all benefits that other employees enjoy. So it would not be in any way a burden or a hindrance to existing DNI initiatives that organizations have taken place. It actually offers a bit more of a streamlined sort of structure and a lot more safeguards for trans employees within the company itself. Because thus far we've always enjoyed those safeguards. It's not like the law has not recognized the need for safeguards and protections for trans communities. It's just that so far it's been limited to just the NALSA judgment and the Navdev Singh judgment of 2018. Now that the statute is in place, it's just clarified very clearly that trans employees cannot be pushed out of their workspace, they cannot be discriminated against, they cannot be denied employment or promotion opportunities simply because of their gender identity. So a statute that specifically states that makes it easier then for companies to build on the language of the law and make this a little more relevant to the company's own context and policies.
Great. And but one of the aspect of the act is also about the gender identity of an individual, right? And it does kind of has a strict procedure now if somebody has to actually identify themselves as a transgender person, which perhaps might also have an implication on the documentation process as well, that whether it is Aadhaar card or their passport or so and so forth. Do you have any comments on that aspect?
Right. So before we come to the identification issue, there's one major problem with this act, in that it conflates a transgender person's identity with an intersex person's identity in the very definition of a trans person. So there is a fair amount of very shoddy drafting that has gone into the act. It's almost a very hasty sort of measure that you see. So this act applies not only to trans persons, it also applies to intersex persons as well. And the process of self-identification, which was laid down in the NALSA judgment, is only in name captured in this particular statute. Because the procedure that they've laid down now is far more complex. It's also far more inaccessible to the community to actually go through this process and get their documentation in place. For those of us who probably do not know this process laid down in the Act, now Chapter 3 of the statute basically lays down the entire method in which a person can go ahead and apply for a certificate of identification. The process is that as an adult trans person, you need to approach a district magistrate, file a case over there, along with supporting documents which have not yet been prescribed in the statute. We need to wait for the rules to be framed for us to know exactly what documents we need to produce before the magistrate. And essentially apply for an identification card, asking for our identity, gender identity to be named as transgender. So at the very first level, there is no opportunity for me as a person who has not undergone surgery to identify as either male or female. I will be pushed into the transgender category. Subsequently, the magistrate, upon deliberation and looking at those documents, which again we don't know what documents we will have to produce before the court, they will issue a certificate of identification granting you gender identity as transgender. Now, this certificate will then have to be used by a community member to change their gender identity in all other existing government ID cards, whether it's your Aadhaar, your passport, your voter ID, your ration card, so on and so forth. Um, the second level of certification, which is also an extremely problematic process because gender identity is something that ought to be self-declared. It should not be certified by a third party. And this is one of the biggest problems the community and activists across the country have with this law. Now, the second level of it is that should I choose to undergo surgery, while surgery is not mandatory, I will then need to get another certificate from the chief medical officer of the hospital that has conducted the surgery, take that back to the magistrate through a fresh petition and ask for my gender identity to reflect either of the binary gender identities I choose to take the surgery on for. And the biggest problem with this portion is also the fact that it creates a hierarchy of identification in terms of somebody who has undergone surgery given the option of choosing within the male-female binary, and someone who hasn't undergone surgery to be stuck within the transgender identity, whether they like it or not, which is completely contrary to everything that we've worked for and everything we've seen thus far. This would also create a huge problem for people who are gender non-binary, persons who are gender fluid, gender non-conforming, because all of these identities are recognized within the definition of a trans person, but their documentation as per this law is not going to reflect that. So we are going to be seeing definite contestations on this particular provision. It's only a matter of time to see whether it gets tweaked at the rulemaking stage or whether it's brought before a court in the form of a challenge. Another thing that is also very problematic with this process is that a trans person is now given the opportunity to only change their first name to reflect their change in preferred gender. Earlier and now as well, we do have many instances where people have been pushed out of their native families and just do not want any association with those families, so they change their entire name. Now, the act here locks you in with the native families, and that's also going to add a lot more pressure and burden on a member of the community to actually get their documentation process complete.
So what I really understand is, so definitely it is going to kind of impact the documentation process at some point, right?
Yes.
And when this entire hiring drive is going to be happening with the organization trying to kind of adopt more transgender people into workforce, um, what do you think can we do about the documentation process for easy hiring? Is there going to be any change that the organizations have to keep in mind?
So thus far, the process of putting your documents in place in organizations who have trans employees will already know this, is that we have a self-declared affidavit that the member of the community swears to, stating that this is how they would like their gender identity to be recognized in official documentation. This is the name that they choose for themselves. And this affidavit is then notarized, and then you have a newspaper publication. Now, these two documents, the affidavit and the newspaper publication, will then be used to change subsequent ID cards. Now, while the Act has been published for general information, it hasn't yet come into force. So, this practice that we've been following thus far of the affidavit and newspaper publications is something that can continue right up until the date of notification of the statute. We have absolutely no idea when the government is actually going to notify the law. There's usually never any indication of when this current procedure is going to kick in. There are possibilities of the government waiting for the rules to be drafted and then notify both the statute and the rules at the same time. So you have like a comprehensive framework to work with. There are also opportunities for the government to notify the statute at a much later time, then start the rulemaking process. So you're looking at an indefinite period of waiting almost. So up until the date from which the act kicks in, the process of self-identification that we see right now, the affidavit, the newspaper publications, is something that companies can very comfortably continue to adopt. And another thing to just keep in mind is that this is predominantly a civil law, meaning that once the law comes into effect, it's not going to have any retrospective action. So employees who have already been taken into the company's fold need not comply with the provisions of this particular statute. This would only apply to fresh applications that come in subsequent to the law actually being notified in the Gazette of India for coming into effect. So until such date, companies can continue to adopt whatever policies they have and continue to use the same process of gender identification that we currently have in place.
Great. I think that's a very credible knowledge shared, Deepta. I want to kind of divert our conversation a little bit on the workplace harassment. Does this act protect the transgender employees against workplace discrimination or any sort of sexual harassment, etc.?
Okay, so this is again a very contentious portion of the current statute because what the law says is that all employers of trans and intersex persons now have the duty to ensure that there is no discrimination in the workplace, no harassment in the workplace, no bias or say malpractice in terms of hiring, recruiting, promotion, so on and so forth. Companies also now have a very clear mandate to ensure that all measures for inclusivity are put in place, meaning access to all common spaces within the workspace, a comfortable restroom facility, so on and so forth. The new thing that the law introduces is akin to your internal complaints committee in prevention of sexual harassment framework, wherein they say that companies will now have to set up a separate grievance redressal or a complaint mechanism facility, almost like another internal complaints committee, to ensure that the provisions of this statute are being implemented by the company. And you have a very clear grievance redressal mechanism for trans and intersex communities to approach in case they face any sort of issues within the workspace. So it kind of make sure that companies also take it very seriously when it comes to protecting the rights of trans people within their fold. At the same time, we do also have a very problematic provision in terms of punishment or the kind of sentencing that could possibly happen, wherein all forms of harassment, discrimination, abuse, violence, whether it is of an economic nature, verbal, or physical, sexual. The prescribed punishment for each of these things is a blanket 6 months to 2 years of imprisonment with a fine. So that is not at all in parity with existing criminal legal frameworks for similar offences. where the minimum at least would be a 7 or a 10 year punishment, and the maximum could go all the way up to death in the rest of rare cases. So this statute and this grievance redressal part, at least in terms of the kind of recourse I would have, or the kind of sentencing that you could expect in a particular scenario of a formal complaint or a criminal case being filed, the disparity in sentencing very clearly shows that trans people, even within the framework of this law, are not treated at par with cisgender heterosexual persons who enjoy far greater safeguards under various other statutes. But in terms of the company itself, the only major changes that companies could potentially expect is to set up a separate grievance redressal mechanism or system to deal with any complaints that would fall under the ambit of this act.
Great. So while we are continuing this conversation with Deepika, I would encourage the participants to please drop your questions in the chat box, and we will pick it up by the end of the conversation. Deepika, moving on, what do you think will this act have any impact on the workplace benefits? Say, for example, insurance coverage policies and any such inclusive benefits that we also extend to the transgender employees. Do you think this act is going to be impacting in any way, positive, negative, whatever way it is?
So, whether the act succeeds in doing so or not, I feel is a secondary sort of question. Because right now the act is extremely vague when it comes to, in particular, healthcare or support for trans persons. One thing that the act very clearly says, though, is that insurance facilities ought to be made available to trans community members for medical procedures like gender affirmatory surgery, hormone therapy, laser treatment, so on and so forth, which thus far have not been easily insurable simply because they're not treated as very important for someone's life. They're not life threatening, they're not essential to save their life. They're treated as mostly cosmetic sort of surgeries. But there are already several Indian companies that offer these insurance safeguards after bargaining with their insurance providers. So once this law comes into force, there is a distinct possibility for various state governments and the central government themselves notifying that insurance companies ought to start taking up these specific medical needs as something that can be the subject matter of insurance coverage. In addition to that, we do not have much clarity in the statute regarding anything that the company would mandatorily have to comply with in terms of medical support. But essentially, the ethos of the act, and that's again the very vague way in which the act has been drafted. One can argue and build a case that companies ought to ensure that they provide insurance coverage, they provide medical facilities, they offer or extend leave facilities for trans employees while they're undergoing that process of surgery. So this is one question that we will not be able to find a very clear answer to, but I can build arguments in favor of the trans members' right to access medical support from the company.
Right. And what I also understand is now from your message, it's very clear that while the act is in place, it still has a lot of deliberation to be done till the enforcement happens. However, from a culture standpoint within the organization, what are those things that the organizations can do within? Has there to be more education about this particular act, or what is the kind of message that you have for the organizations at this point?
Well, right now, the act is definitely something that is a very good starting point on conversations about inclusivity and about just understanding gender identity and the intersex experience within the organization. Because for good or for bad, this law has very many examples of what you can do right and also what you can do very, very wrong. So, if facilitated properly, the fact that this law has now come into the statute books is a very good opportunity for companies to start reviewing it, reading it, especially for those who already have policies regarding inclusivity and non-discrimination, in addition to the mandatory sexual harassment policies, right? This particular statute will give you a good measure or a sense of how much better your policies already are, or how much more you have to possibly work towards. In addition to that, just as an employee's experience in the workspace, it's very easy for us to assume that just because the law has changed or the law has been introduced, people's perceptions of the manner in which we interact with each other, treat each other at a very social level in the organization, whether professionally or even outside the workspace, just as colleagues, it's almost like a fantasy to think that the statute is going to change public mindsets. Because even today we do come across on a very regular basis crisis cases, both from within corporate workspaces and outside as well. So we are looking at, of course, a shared responsibility of the state, of companies, and of employees themselves to have these conversations regularly, just to be up to date on the lived realities of the trans community, because the trans community itself is not a single homogeneous unit. There is enormous diversity across the trans identity. So to have these conversations would be great. And the fact that the law is now here kind of ensures that we have to have these conversations, because there is a compliance mechanism that's inbuilt within the law, especially for companies.
Sure. Thank you so much, Deepta, for sharing that insight. Definitely, that message is very clear for the organizations that, while the act is definitely something that the transgender community is very sensitive about, I think we should have the responsibility to share that affection within the culture of the organization, and create that inclusive culture for the transgender employees, which also means that when we do our education to our hiring managers, our existing managers, team members, it is important to kind of talk about the transgender act and the nuances of that, and and yet it is not going to be something that affects internally in any way, no matter what. I just have one final question before I open it up for our question and answer session. How can companies play a part in ensuring inclusion towards transgender employees? And this, I'm not talking from internal perspective. Do you think that the companies outside can come together, can do something about to ensure that there is more inclusion towards transgender employees?
Well, I can speak from our personal experience within Rahi when we handle crisis cases. That there certainly are a lot more companies that are willing to interview and train candidates from within the trans community, but fall short in understanding, as I said, the lived reality of the community. There are many cases in which many members from the community cannot access that process of interviewing and hiring and the various stages that go into the hiring process, simply because they do not have a fixed shelter space. So just because they cannot stay in a city for a particular period of time means that they lose out on a job opportunity. They might not also have the financial wherewithal to connect to a webinar like we're doing right now. So being mindful of these realities, possibly offering short-term shelter support during the duration of the hiring process is something that would go a long way, because then you would have far more candidates coming forward and being willing to participate in the process. Otherwise, you're just restricting yourself to candidates who have, by some means or the other, managed to save up money to just go through this process. In addition, some of the challenges that we faced have also come from the fact that not all of their ID proofs reflect the change that has happened through the affidavit. And this is typically because various government departments handle different ID cards. For instance, Aadhaar is in a different office, passport is a different office, voter ID is a different office. And it takes a lot of time for us to reflect the same change across each of these ID proofs. So if companies can recognize that difficulty and give more weightage and importance to that affidavit in the paper publication and allow subsequently the candidate to submit other ID proofs to support that, it would be very, very useful. It won't place an undue burden on the candidate to pursue a job opportunity and also put in place various ID proofs at a very fast pace. In addition to this, I think one thing that cannot be stressed upon enough is just the need to have these conversations on a very regular basis, because the nature of vulnerability of marginalized communities at large, and in particular the trans community, is that the law is changing very, very fast. So the community itself is not entirely aware of the nitty-gritties of how they can access this particular statute. So to have these conversations within the office would be extremely crucial to make sure that everybody is up to speed, so that when a new employee enters the workspace, they don't feel segregated or they don't feel othered in that workspace.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepa, for that. We have a couple of questions which has come up from the audience here. So the first one is, does company need to have a special policy or internal complaints committee for transgender employees? This question is coming from Rupali. Do you
Right.
think that we need to have a special policy?
See, this is something that some companies already have put in place. When you talk about, say, a sexual harassment policy or an internal complaints committee that operates under the POSH Act, one option, of course, that is open to companies is to build on the POSH Act and throw protection for complaints against sexual harassment open, regardless of one's gender identity. So that is something that companies can definitely think about to make your POSH policies gender inclusive, not necessarily neutral, but inclusive. If you look at the statute, it does mandate a complaints mechanism for trans employees to be able to access in case there is a violation of any provision of the statute. So there is potentially the possibility of us having a separate grievance redressal mechanism that we will have to put in place should the act be notified. But until such time, what companies can potentially do is work within the framework of existing grievance redressal mechanisms and include, say, minor amendments to cover the grievances specifically pertaining to the trans community. Once the act is notified, then you can implement policies in accordance with the rules, because we're not just operating on the guidelines in the statute. We need to look at the rules that are drafted by the government to see exactly who needs to be on this complaints committee, what kind of mandate do they have, how long would they work, what is the format in which a complaint would be given. So all of those specificities will come out only in the rules. So until then, I think it would be safest to make changes to the existing grievance redressal mechanisms that the company already has in place to reflect whatever mandates the act is now putting on companies. And falling back on your POSH grievance redressal mechanisms and making those more gender inclusive, because they will all tie in together eventually at a later point of time. For companies that already have non-discrimination policies, this doesn't look like it's going to cause too much of a problem. It's probably going to result in minor terminology changes that wouldn't take too much time.
Great, thank you. Another question which has come from Rupali is, specifically when we are doing the joining documentation. She wants to know a little bit more about the joining documentation that can be produced by a trans candidate.
So definitely, a trans candidate would be in a position to submit the self-declared affidavit, which categorically tells you that they were identified by their dead name up until this point, and subsequently they wish to be known by their chosen name, and they will state their name. And they will also clearly state that this was the gender that was assigned to them at birth, and this is the gender that's been reflected in all of their documentation thus far. And subsequently, this is the gender they wish to be identified by. And along with the affidavit, you will also have paper publications in two newspapers, one in English and one in Kannada if they're from Karnataka, or from anywhere else in the state in English and one of the local languages. Um, in addition to this, many people will be able to get ID cards changed to reflect their affidavits at various degrees of success and various speeds. So from what we've seen, Aadhaar is usually the one that's easiest to change. Driver's license is fairly easy and fast to change. So to not place an excessive burden on asking for, say, multiple ID cards that reflect one's chosen name and gender identity, but to stick with the affidavit as the fundamental document with the paper publications. And if they can produce one or two ID cards, I think that should be more than sufficient.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Deepta. I have another question coming from Preeti. In fact, two questions from her. The first one is, would the companies need to introduce an option to mark gender as transgender specifically, or an option of other gender would help?
I think transgender would be easier because if you've been following the news lately, the Tamil Nadu government recently introduced a government order that said that they would no longer be using Tirunangai and Tirunambi, which are Tamil terms for members of the trans community, and they would be going back to the third gender or the other gender option. And this is something that is extremely degrading for a member of the community to be treated as someone who's the other, right, as opposed to male or female. So what you could possibly do is give options for male, female, trans, intersex, and you have a third option which says if you have a specific manner in which you choose to identify your gender, that is gender fluid, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, probably leave a space blank for them to articulate what they would like their gender to be reflected as. At the same time, while the column on gender is something that we focus on a lot, I would suggest you start introducing a similar column on preferred pronouns. Because many people from across the spectrum of the trans community would choose to identify with different pronouns at different points of time. Most prefer to go with gender neutral pronouns, them, they. So to make this a habit in all your forms would, I think, just make it easier for the employee to integrate into the workforce a lot better. And also it trains the existing staff members to be conscious of someone's gender and be respectful of that.
Great. There's a lot of questions which is actually coming up, but we will also keep an eye on the time. But we will ensure that these questions are answered and sent back. Another question from Preeti is: intersex people may identify as transgender people. Would this mean that they will not be considered as transgender till they go through the sex reassignment surgery?
Okay, so the confusion that the law creates is that the definitions clause of the act is, in my opinion, very, very poorly drafted. Now, as an intersex person, I do have the right to self-identify my gender and also determine what physical characteristics, physical external characteristics my body should also have. So in cases where parents decide that at birth, is when much of the conflict arises for an intersex person because they would never have had the opportunity to physically emulate the gender identity they feel and experience. There is absolutely no mandate as per NALSA or as per this statute also that I need to undergo surgery before I can be identified, at least in documents, as a transgender person. The place where the law, the statute, the act falls flat is when they say that you need to undergo surgery and you need to produce a certificate from the chief medical officer of that hospital to choose your gender identity within the binary of male and female. The other loophole also is that there's no opportunity for me to identify as an intersex person if I so choose to do so. So surgery would only, at least under the framework of this statute, be a question if a trans person wants to identify within the binary of male and female. And of course, identifying as an intersex person doesn't arise, which is why they've kind of conflated the definitions of trans and intersex into one umbrella term, namely trans, which is not helping us at all, but that's the flawed way in which the statute is operated.
Great. Okay, and one last question that I can take right now in the interest of time would be coming from Arnav. How do we talk for trans who do not wish to go through transition?
Ah. Um, Now, thus far, we do not have any mandate for a trans person to undergo surgery or undertake any hormone replacement therapy or anything of the sort. Surgery has never been the yardstick by which one's gender identity has been expressed or articulated. And to an extent, as per this act, surgery is not going to influence the manner in which I identify as a trans person. What the act has done is create that hierarchy again of surgery if you want to be identified as male or female. Now, until this act comes into place or comes into effect, what I would suggest is for companies to still fall back on the affidavit, the self declared gender identity of the employee who has come to you for a job, and follow the documentation process that you already have in place based on what this candidate wishes to be identified as, because this act is not yet enforced and the NALSA judgment still applies. And as per the NALSA judgment, a person's gender identity is only self declared. And no third party can create this kind of hierarchy of surgery, no surgery, which identities are open to me if I do surgery, which identities are open to me if I don't do surgery, right? So that is a deeply flawed and problematic sort of mechanism, which I would suggest companies just don't adopt, because that will definitely come up for challenge at some point or the other. Instead, at least until the act comes into place, go ahead with the affidavit and what the affidavit says.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful insight, Deepta. We will quickly get into your valuable feedback. I'm sorry, but because of the interest of time, we have to kind of quickly wrap it up. But on a scale of 1 to 5, to what extent do you understand the Trans Bill 2019 after today's session? You have about 15 seconds to answer. Great, thank you so much. We will ensure that all these questions which are still in the queue would be answered, and we are going to send the responses to everybody. The next question is, would you recommend this session to your colleagues and peers? Great, and thank you so much for this, everybody. I think I have personally gained a lot of knowledge through this webinar. I hope all of you have had a similar experience as well. It only assures that as organizations, we can still continue on our path of inclusion by hiring transgender candidates, and more so educate the employee base about this act. Community Business will be very happy to collaborate with you in this journey and help carry these conversations in your own companies through training and consulting partnership. So please reach out to me or my team members, Kapila, Vijay, and Sandeep. And so with that, it just leaves me to finally say a huge thank you to Deepta once again for being with us today and sharing insights into this topic. This is such a valuable conversation. And to
Always a
all
pleasure.
of you, wonderful, lovely. And to all of you, wonderful audience, for logging in and listening to us today. So I, on behalf of Community Business, wish you all a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. Thank you all. Take care.